Welcome to the Insightful Investor Podcast, a weekly series that seeks to share industry, investment, and market insights. Learn more about our show at insightfulinvestor.org. Joining me today is Dr. Richard Orlando. Richard is founder of Legacy Capitals and author of two books, Legacy and Love Your Clients. He has spent his career helping wealthy families navigate the complex human dynamics of preserving and transferring wealth, and he has trained and coached advisors to do the same. Richard, thank you so much for joining me today.
Alex, thanks for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
I am as well. We spend a lot of time discussing investing on this podcast. Today's topic is a little bit different as we delve into the soft side of wealth management. Why don't we start with what originally sparked your interest in this area?
So to the credit of Alex, what you and your firm are doing with this podcast is you're factoring in what we call the human capital side, or some people call the soft side. And that's really important in planning and wealth transfer and serving, especially families with multi-generational wealth. So to your question, what got me interested is I was inside of Drexel Burnham many years ago, which was an investment banking firm, and then Merrill Lynch, private bank, for many years before I founded Legacy Capitals. And you and I met at Merrill Lynch many years ago. Wealth management, estate planning, tax minimization are all crucial parts of serving families, especially families of significant wealth. But without addressing the human capital side, at least as I perceived it, it missed a really important aspect of planning. Or what we like to say is a lot of planning gets focused, understandably, on preparing assets for our clients, but little planning focuses on preparing the family for those assets. And it's this other soft side or human capital side that I realize is not only not being addressed effectively, but it might be the very piece that helps the advisor, the firm, and ultimately the client family create a plan of success of moving values and valuables across the generations.
If we were computers, then we wouldn't need all that.
You need at least both, and then some combination integration. Yeah.
So you have a PhD in family systems. Would you tell us what that entails?
Yeah. Another important aspect is as we shift from serving primarily an individual decision maker, as your firm does, as others professionals do, to a family group over time. It doesn't happen immediately, serving the spouse, serving the adults in the next generation, especially if it's an operating family business, as an example. It's important to understand, maybe on the human capital side or the psychology side, what other skills or what other understanding is important to know when you're moving from one person to a family system. So I chose many years ago, it's a long time ago now, that I achieved the PhD. But in part, it was the bias of my upbringing that I always just thought understanding family was a more effective way of understanding the individual. From an academic perspective, I'm going to oversimplify the field of psychology. There's basically, for the origin, for many, many decades, really had an individual model, just seeing the individual as the patient and working with them. Murray Bowen and some other pioneers, they learned that it's more effective to understand the individual in the context of a family system. And it's the family system that can contribute to the well-being or the not so well-being of an individual. So I chose family systems because I thought it was a more effective way of coaching, training, and engaging individuals and families. And when advisors do that, part of our training, and I allude to it in my book, Love Your Clients, which was written for advisors. I talk about this a little bit, but understanding the family system. For example, if you're working with one or two family members, understanding that they all have roles in the family and the family is working towards some kind of balance of keeping things, it's going to sound a little academic, homeostasis, like a thermostat. So when you change one part, it has a ripple effect through the other parts. So just understanding some basic concepts like that could help institute a plan with the family that could be more effective if we just start thinking of the family as more than the individual. As a matter of fact, what we like to say is, we call it whole family advising. We say, do you see the client as the individual or as the family? Even though you might be working with one or two family members who are the owners of the assets and the creator of the assets.
It's interesting. You could go from we're computers to we're individuals to we're individuals within a family that has interrelationships and one part impacts another. And how do you view what you're working towards?
100%. As a matter of fact, I literally just got off a call. We're working with a multi generational, very successful family business in real estate, and they're trying to figure out how to go from generation 2 to 3. And we're getting to know generation 3 and understanding what they're thinking about their lives and their professional ambitions and the legacy of the family. And are they technically available? And how do they relate? And how did the prior generation relate? Is all part of the puzzle pieces. And that's what we're learning now with this family and the others that we serve. So just having that lens, obviously, a decision maker is vital, and we understand the uniqueness of that, but it plays out in the system.
It's in some ways far more complex than an individual that is already complex. So you were at Merrill Lynch for some time. As you mentioned, that's where you and I met. I was there for 15 years. Would you share some of your experiences and key learnings while working there?
We overlapped, and I was there for the same amount of time, 15 years. That was a lot of my learning because that was when I started to really engage alongside the advisors, helping them serve their, in that case, ultra high net worth families. Continue to do that till today. I think some of the learnings early on was, and I kind of hinted at it before with your initial question of the soft side or the human capital side, is I was seeing too much of what consultants and coaches were doing with families as being what I'll call too conventional or too one or two dimensional. They almost couldn't get out of the way of staying on the spreadsheet side of the equation. The spreadsheet side, meaning, yeah, the technical side. And I have an estate plan. I have wealth managers in my own family life, so it's foundational. But what I think I learned a lot more was families, whether they use this language or not, they had this personal GPS, which consisted of their values, what they were trying to accomplish in their enterprise, with their wealth, with their family. And a lot of what I started to learn from literally sitting across the kitchen table and the boardroom table of hundreds of families alongside their advisors is what else were they wrestling with, or what else did they need to factor in, especially as they were trying to prepare the next generation. And that's where that need came from, not only just communication, like a lot of people go to, yeah, families just need to communicate. That's part of it, of course. But what are they communicating about? And that dance between, let's call it the leading generation, the parents, not wanting to be too transparent or transparent at all yet until their children were older and more mature, more responsible, more ready. How do you go from not communicating at all to communicating in a way that you're not being fully transparent? Because part of preparing the next generation is education, is raising their financial acumen. But it's also, well, what's the purpose of our assets? What's the purpose of our business? What's the purpose of our giving? And starting to integrate them. So a lot of that learning was really reinforcing the need for adding on and integrating the family capital side of working with families. And a number of the topics, and I'll pause after this, actually contributed to my legacy book, which I think we're going to get to chat about, because I kept hearing similar questions in their own way, but there was just these overriding themes that came about.
It seems like when you have a lot of reps going through this, that you'll see common issues that come up, common needs, and you can develop expertise because an individual family might only go through it once, that transition. Whereas if you have expertise in that transition, you can help minimize the mistakes that they make in that one turn.
I like that. When you get the reps, you start to see some trends and patterns. And then the wisdom is how to bring that understanding, but customize it, bring that family some guidance and wisdom that will speed up what they're trying to accomplish in a more effective way.
What types of families do you typically work with at Legacy Capitals? And at a high level, because we'll get into details, how do you generally help them?
Generally, we say that it's families with multi generational wealth. That's a very generic term. And that's really what we say, is because to them, they're aware of the fact that there's enough wealth that there has to be some intentional planning for future generations. What that looks like in real numbers is it's usually families, not because we have a minimum, but usually it's families of 30, 40, 50 million at the lower end to hundreds. And there's not that many billionaires, but to some billionaires.
There's more these days than there has been.
Thanks to technology, there's quite a bit more, as you well know in your world. That's kind of the quantitative and qualitative side. There's an intention to move assets and values forward. And so it requires a multi generational vision and plan. What we tend to do is literally anything from what is the multi generational vision? I'll give you a few families that we're working with, but the themes are the same. What is the purpose and vision for the wealth? And that could range from one of our clients said, I want to create a dynasty. That's their words. And they'll refer to the Rockefellers. Or one of our families who I would say on paper, meaning their operating entities plus their liquid wealth, close to $1 billion, they said their vision is we don't know who our family is going to be in 4 or 5 generations. I don't want to plan for them. I want to make sure that we give away everything plus what we want to use for a few generations before the fifth generation. So just helping them get clear on the vision, the purpose, their North Star. What are they shooting for? And then creating a plan of preparation or transition of leadership, stewardship, whether it's running the family foundation, whether it's partnering with a firm like yours, you're bringing the next generation to integrate with your firm, as an example, or maybe it's being an operator, not just an owner of the family enterprise. And we have lots of families, I just referred a moment ago to just getting off a call, where it looks like 2 of the 4 in the next generation are not interested in operating the business, which is very successful real estate business, but they want to be good family members and they're going to be owners. So part of what we do is a little bit of education. What's the difference between an owner versus an operator versus a family member? What are the responsibilities? What's the governance that wraps around that? And then in some families, I'm oversimplifying, but this is a good indication. We help them create their family charter or their family constitution, which basically is a way to compile their vision, their values, their governance, their philanthropy, their family policies, so that this organic document stays alive and moves through the generations, but it governs and organizes and keeps them in the path that they want to go as a family. And then there's other pieces like preparing the next generation, coaching the next generation. One of the members on our team is from a very successful generation. She's a Generation 3 family member. They had a massive liquidity event. The business was doing over $1 billion in revenue, and they sold a few years ago. So she brings some real insight, perspective of a successful family business. She was on the board. So we help with those other topics in preparing leadership in the next generation. And then we have some programs just for couples, because sometimes the couple doesn't know where to begin. How do we minimize entitlement? How do we help prepare the next generation? There's other pieces, but I would say some of those are the core pieces. And we do that in many cases alongside a firm like yours, where we're a complement, and in some cases, a slight overlap to what you all are doing for your families.
How would you say that significant wealth can create both opportunities, which I think a lot of people are probably more familiar with, but it can also create a lot of challenges for families?
The grass is always greener on the other side, unless it's artificial turf, is how the expression goes. Yeah, it clearly brings some opportunities. And that's, I think, the fantasy and the attraction and the enticement of having more money than less. Although the research, I think it's mostly survey research that I'm aware of, says that once an individual or a family has, the number varies, but it's in this ballpark, $70,000 to $90,000 of annual income a year or household income a year. After that, there's not necessarily a correlation to happiness. Now, you could be insanely happy, but I think the premise of that is having some of your basic needs met, or not have to think about retirement, or not have to worry that you could pay for your children to get really good health care, or travel around the world. There's a lot of benefits. Some of the challenges, or the common ones, are especially if the wealth is, we'll call it newer to the generations 1, 2, 3. Although it can ripple beyond that, but let's just say, especially those first few generations, is keeping perspective. Keeping, as they've said to us, and in their own ways, is let's say I'm talking to G1 or G2, the primary wealth creators. How do we keep our middle class values, yet my children are in private schools, we fly private. And so this challenge is we could maybe meet all of our children's wants and needs, but is that the right thing to do for them? Does that undermine their flourishing? The other challenge is fair versus equal, especially if there's operating entities and not all family members or even family branches are involved in the operating business. How do you treat that from an estate planning, from a salary, from ownership? How do you keep that fair and equal? In many cases, fair and equal are not the guidelines for doing that. So those are the challenges, is raising other generations in it who didn't see what it took to create the world, how to navigate family dynamics in terms of who's interested in continuing to do that and who's not, and then how do you treat that fairly from an estate plan or compensation perspective. And then just the broad sense of losing perspective of not everyone has the fortune to be able to travel the way we do, go to the schools that we go to. So those are some of the challenges alongside the opportunities.
Something that you said earlier, I thought is really insightful, which is just the data on once you hit a certain level of income and you meet the main needs that people need, beyond that, there isn't a direct correlation between wealth and happiness. That right there says a lot. I think most people who are either at the line or below think that more wealth creates happiness, but along with it comes all these other issues. They're not necessarily financial issues, they're the human side of it and all the complexities that are created by that. And so if you just think about the industry where there's a heavy focus on let's manage the wealth, you miss a lot of the reasons that there isn't a strong correlation between wealth and happiness. That's how you connect those dots. And it's so important.
That's perfect connection. Exactly. You just help in a short way further build the case of why it's important for those who are serving that multi-generational family to factor in all of those dimensions to the family.
And if you do it well, then maybe there is more of a correlation. The correlation should be there theoretically, but it's broken because there's all these other issues that come up. And unless you hit those directly, you basically don't have that correlation.
You just reminded me, sometimes I'll share with families, it's an analogy or a metaphor. And I say, when there's significant wealth in a family, it's almost like if you think of the orbit, that's the sun, all of this wealth. And then the family is rotating around it. Assuming it's the values of the family and what they've asked us to work on, I say to them, how do we flip that around where the family's in the middle and the wealth is existing to serve the family? Because that gravitational pull that everyone's just paying attention to the sun, the assets, and almost at the sacrifice or in serving the wealth, I want to be as confident as I can with knowing that there's always exceptions. But when the family's serving the wealth, I think it's harder to have that strong correlation of meaning, purpose, and happiness with significant wealth.
What would you say are the major decisions wealthy families typically face?
So, in addition to what you know intimately from what you and your firm does, in addition to help me grow my assets, protect my assets, minimize my tax, minimize my risk, those are all foundational. I'm going to speak on, in addition, the other questions that are the ones that I was hinting at before that we heard in so many ways over and over again. I'd say the top 3 to 5 questions are, and this is what's covered in my legacy book. They would say to us, how do we talk about our wealth with our kids? Do we? Because, and behind that question is mostly fear, some curiosity, but because if they knew how much wealth we have and how much wealth they might be responsible for one day or have access to, we might create entitlement unintentionally. One of the biggest questions is how and when do we talk about this? Another one is how do we prepare the next generation? What are we preparing them for is really the opening question. But how do we prepare them? They're busy, they're young, they might be 7 years old, they might be 27 years old, they might be 47 years old. Well, by 47, hopefully some work has been done, but each family is slightly different. But preparing the next generation is really important. How do I transfer my wealth? And not necessarily technically, because there's a lot of smart people that could do that, but do I share some while we're alive? Do I invest in a business for my children? What criteria does the business plan need to have? Do we wait till we're dead and that's it? I play on these terms in my book. the difference between a gift and a transfer. Now, technically, from an IRS definition, that gift means something, whether it's 19,000 annual exclusion gift for 2025 or the other terms of gifts. But I play off of them by saying, is it a gift? If you're choosing to give whatever amount of money or access or income from maybe a trust to your loved ones, is it a gift or is it a transfer? And the distinction I make, if it's a gift, then make it a gift. It's like you gave them a Christmas gift or a birthday gift. Hopefully they're appreciative, but there's no strings attached. But if there's meant to be strings attached, I'll call that a transfer. In other words, there's a certain minimum expectation of accomplishment in your life, or maybe it's a certain level of education or whatever it is. And you have some strings attached to it. They have to be a good steward of it. They can't be abusing substances. Then that's a transfer. And I try to make the case that in some cases, what I've learned from serving families is it's probably better to, as one of the, I can still hear this, I think she was G5 or G4. She said to her parents, which would have been, I think, G3 at the time, the fact that you opened up the spigot for me over the years helped me be more ready for what I'm now aware of. So whether to open this spigot means you paid for my college and then you gave me a little bit of income to live in New York City or LA and you paid for my wedding, or then you gave me access to an account where some income substituted my income. The idea is opening up that spigot over time. What we like to say is move towards transparency. Probably better prepares the next generation than going from silence and zero to, oh my gosh, I'm worth fill in the blank, multi millions of dollars. That's another big question is how do we share assets amongst family members? I think it's the last chapter of my book. I talk about that just because people are related by blood or marriage doesn't mean they have the skills to share assets and do governance together. So a lot of our work with families sometimes is just preparing the next generation. We put them through simulations of having to work together and make decisions, sometimes on hypothetical scenarios and sometimes on actual family assets that the prior generations give permission to use as a case study. So navigating, preparing, how do we prepare the next generation? How do we talk about it? How do we minimize entitlement? How do we have our family share in the family business, that fairness equal? Who's on the board of the private foundation? Who's an owner but doesn't have voting shares? Just navigating all of those decisions. And then the philanthropy part, when to start bringing your next generation into your philanthropy. Do they have a voice? Do they have a vote? Is it their money? Is it your money? Do you match their giving? All of those questions are really important questions. Not only questions, but helping your families get solutions to put in place so that they can find the benefits and experience the benefits together.
And obviously, one of the main goals is to ensure happiness and a fulfilled life for all the family members. What insights can you share in that area?
So when I start to write the legacy book, the first book, I didn't really think about a happiness chapter, but because we found them saying to us over and over again, and I said it before, is they would go through these deep conversations and we'd talk about the money. And then they would say, the bottom line is, I just want my family to be happy. They'd end in some way like that most of the time, not every time. I was already a fan of what's called positive psychology and some of the happiness research, which now has taken off from Arthur Brooks at Harvard to Seligman at the University of Penn and many others. But it's now becoming much more understood and known. I just surveyed the happiness research plus my own experience, and I wrote a chapter on happiness. What I tried to do is take the research and then translate it to what a family or an individual could do about it. At the end of the chapter, I think I list 10 behaviors or attitudes that contribute to a meaningful, flourishing life or a happy life. So, for example, achievement. So, for someone to experience achievement contributes to a meaningful, happy life. So, how do you translate that? Well, if I have enough resources and I make it really easy for my kids, I'm actually possibly robbing them of struggle. So, we want them to have achievement. Maintaining a mindset of gratitude. My kids are a bit older now, although we still do it, but sometimes you might just sit around the table with your loved ones, whether they're 7 years old or Thanksgiving dinner, and everyone talk about what they're grateful for. Practicing gratitude, giving or sharing with others is another attribute in the happiness research, which is, we don't get credit for this, but time, talent, or treasure. Not every family member is at a place where they can give away their financial assets because they might not have any. They might be a working student or not even a working student, just a student. But how do they contribute back to others? Forgiveness, forgiving others. There's 10 that I list, but these are 3 or 4. Having a clear purpose. Dr. Seligman talks about, and he's the professor at Wharton, that talks about understand your what he calls your signature strengths, and then do your best to build a life and work around your signature strengths. And by doing that, by practicing gratitude, forgiveness, experiencing achievement, you're starting to shape a life that will have more meaning, purpose, which will lead to more happiness.
So, going through the many reps that we alluded to earlier, what would you say are the common pitfalls of wealth across generations? So, obviously, you have G1 that created the wealth, and then you get one generation removed, G2 and G3, and so on. How should they think about breaking those cycles?
Well, first of all, good planning. I'm always going to assume that there's good planning on the side of the asset side. And then having communication that doesn't necessarily mean full transparency. And part of our couples program, which I talked about earlier when we started, one of the things that we're helping the couple do is create what we call their legacy message. So we give them samples of prior legacy messages that have been created. But in essence, what are you trying to say to your loved ones about who your family is and what your resources represent? Not what your net worth is, not what your inheritance plans are, but having a clear legacy message that is consistent and then will evolve and adapt through the generations is really important. I remember I was in a conversation and I remember talking to the parents. I was just getting to know them, and I was asking them this question: what is the purpose of your assets? And they kept answering that question with how their children can get access to the assets. So I said, no, 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 I understand that's important. I said, but what's the purpose of your assets? And they were worth about 150 million. And immediately they said, we never thought about it. And I said, okay, just be spontaneous. The wife immediately went to philanthropy, giving it to others. And the husband went immediately to entrepreneurship. He said, if people in my family wanted to pursue, with a business plan, I didn't get into the details with them, but what is the purpose of the assets? Just knowing that will help guide what you do with them so that going back to that metaphor of the son is the family and the money is revolving around the family serving what it's trying to accomplish. We're doing everything we can to serve the money. That would be one piece. Making sure that the family is built on their shared values. They don't always have the same exact values, and build on principles of a happy and meaningful life. We also strongly recommend having some kind of family meeting or family retreat once a year, which focuses a combination of things on if there's an operating entity, you might have some portion of the agenda educating or updating non employed family members on the operating entity. It could be a bit of what we call the business of being family. Who are we as a family? What's our family vision? What's our mission? Are we preparing the next generation? And then some fun. So being able to build that amongst the life of busy family members or students that are in multiple states or multiple countries, being able to anchor the family once or twice a year in a vacation and a family retreat or a family meeting would be really helpful. And then the family members, especially in the next set of generations, as they become adults or young adults, getting to know the advisors of the family. So a lot of family members that we work with when we're coaching the next generation, they're not sure that the family's advisors are for them too. Since we get to work with advisors and families, the advisors like totally, the firm wants to do whatever they can to serve the family. So sometimes we're helping connect those dots so that they're becoming educated, informed, but they also know who to go to if mom and dad are not there. So those are some of the things that I think will help minimize the challenges of wealth and keep the family more aligned with what they're trying to accomplish.
A lot of what you're describing is being intentional about the human capital side, the soft side of this. I'm curious if you have some insights to share about, let's say you don't do that and you just let nature run its course. What typically happens with wealthy families as they transition from G1 to G2 to G3 to get a sense of what it's like if you just let it naturally progress on its own?
If the family is fortunate enough to be one that naturally is communicative, close, cohesive, that helps. There are families like that, but too often the wealth complicates as part of implied in your question. So, what probably happens is from an estate planning perspective, there's a minimum amount you would need, but you could perpetuate wealth by itself with enough restrictions on it. You could keep it moving across the generations through generation skipping trusts to making sure a minimum of the income comes out. There's ways to perpetuate the assets. Or if it's operating entities or real estate, you could put non family members as executives running it, even though it's owned and controlled by family. So you could perpetuate assets. But I think part of your question's asking, well, what happens to the family? And I would say, in my experience for the last 20 years, you could probably run the family wealth and the family business for 2 to 3 generations without that intentionality, without what we're doing every day with the families we serve, professionalizing the family and the governance and the preparation. But you're not going to get much further than generation three. Ideally, it's sooner, but I'm going to just say we're seeing consistently now, if a family hasn't done something through generation or begun to be intentional between 2 and 3, the family's dissipated. It has no sense of legacy. No one's been prepared for wealth. So we have been strongly recommending when we're introduced to families and we're serving families that are in that 1, 2, or 3, that they have to start putting in not only intentionality, but actual what we call scaffolding, some level of governance. We talked about the family a moment before this call. There's no boards, advisory or fiduciary. There's no committees. It's what we call a more of a mom and pop culture. Well, they're now going into generation 3. That's not going to work because you could say generation 2 is in the manufacturing location and seeing how things get done. But once generation 3 and generation 4, they're removed from that. It's now almost all wealth that they're responsible for. So I think some scaffolding. Otherwise, I think the family, without some natural benefits in their favor, will lose the momentum. And maybe even worse than that, the assets will dissipate. The legacy or the operating entities will not continue in the family. And if that's what they wanted, fine. But if that's not what they wanted, they're going to need to be intentional about it.
So a lot of what you're describing is the family history and the legacy persisting through time. Why is maintaining a positive legacy so challenging for wealthy families?
I love that you added the word positive because everyone, even if they're not acknowledging it, is creating a legacy. One might be creating a lovely positive legacy, even if they're not using the language you and I are using. But I think when we add this wealth wrapper, significant wealth around it, as we talked about, it provides those benefits, but it also provides those burdens, those challenges that if we're not intentional about creating a positive legacy, then the wealth could, that gravity pull, take us off our core values or our North Star. Then we will not have the positive legacy we intended. I wrote a book called Legacy, but I also speak to a lot of groups like the YPO forums about what we talk about is living your legacy. And to make people more aware of, because I think when wealth is created, a lot of the term legacy tends to suggest end of life planning, what happens with our assets when we're not there. Yes, that's part of it. But I think it's so much more about, and this is what I, in essence, preach to advisors. You're helping and we're helping families live their legacies. And that's the mission of Legacy Capitals. And if we can help them live their intended legacies, almost everyone wants to live a positive legacy. And so if you're clear on your purpose of your assets, you're clear on your core values, then you're much more aligned with having the outcome of the legacy when you're no longer here. My mom just passed away, not to be dramatic, literally a couple of weeks ago. And I only bring that up because I'm emotionally in the place of I literally don't have my mom anymore. So what remains? Yes, there was a few bucks, but it's the memories, her impact on us, how she treated my kids. It's all of this other human capital stuff that most individuals, when I work with them or I speak to YPO groups, say that's the most important stuff. So being intentional, and why I love, Alex, this opportunity that you've asked me to do this podcast. I think The challenge is if we get busy as entrepreneurs creating wealth or only maintaining wealth, then we're not going to have the positive legacy at the end.
One of the biggest concerns I've heard wealthy families raise is, how do I not screw up my kids? Richard, how should they think about keeping their children motivated without negatively impacting them?
This is one of those questions that really keeps parents up at night. And it's an important one because when families and parents and entrepreneurs have significant wealth, they can take care of a lot of things in their kids' lives. And so, how do you keep them motivated when you could have the resources to take care of something? So, a few things, and it's also related to some of what we've talked about regarding the attributes of a happy and meaningful life. But to keep motivated is things like help them, give them opportunities to be challenged and to overcome and to achieve. The achievement piece keeps the motivation. Another guiding principle as a parent is that just because we can take care of things, it doesn't mean we should. Or I have this expression, do we love our children enough not to give them everything we can? And so the idea there is imagine in some ways that your parenting is you don't have access to the resources you do. How would you then guide your kid? What would you expect from them? What would be your counsel to them when they're in a tough situation and they want to back out? Part of that practically is having them work and earn. A lot of parents may not do that, for example, if their children are at the age of university or college, but sometimes they will. Or I've even worked with one or two families where they said to their children, even though they could have paid for everything, they said, we're going to pay for 90% of school. You're going to pay for 10%. And as long as you maintain a B or higher, we'll pay for the 90%. But if it's anything lower than a B, it goes into your 10%. Most parents don't do that, but I would say that motivation piece is to help them identify their passions, their strengths, their goals, encourage, challenge, support, but help them achieve it as best they can within their own efforts. And I think that helps a lot. What we find over time, because what you do for a 7-year-old is not what you might do for a 17-year-old or a 37-year-old. But the general principle, and it's related to some of our conversation already, is this idea of if there are significant family resources, and that is the concern, that how do we make sure these are used to serve our kids and help them flourish, not make them entitled or lose their work ethic, as some parents might say, is that you almost move towards transparency and even terms of access. So maybe there's a payment for school that's fully covered. But now after that, maybe there's a co down payment on a house, not a buying of the house. Or some of our clients will help make sure that there's enough of a down payment on a house so that their children live in a community that's safe and maybe even near them. But then the children have to be able to have enough income to maintain the lifestyle and expenses to carry the home. So you just keep moving towards that progression over time. And then usually parents will see the readiness, the maturity of their children when they can either make access more because the children have proven their own determination and work ethic, and when they might still want to do it a little bit more experimenting.
I think the hard part is when you go from G1 to G2. So G1 creates the wealth. They started with nothing, they built an empire, and they don't want their kids to go through the same struggles that they went through. So they want to give them what their parents weren't able to give them. It seems like there's a natural inclination to want to do better for your kids. I think one of the challenges in that is that unless there's an intention about, if I do that, here are the consequences, and you don't fully understand that, there's a risk that you overdo it. I think part of what you're talking about is figuring out the right balance. If you overdo it and then you have other consequences, and then you're not going to know that until it's too late. And so it's helpful to talk to people who have had the reps, that have seen action A leads to outcome B. Do you like outcome B? If you don't, then maybe you should deviate. I think a lot of it is just better insight.
You nailed it, and especially as you said, with that newer significant wealth, is what it took for us to get here. I want my kids to have some benefit from that. And the chapter in my book, Legacy, that's focused on preparing the next generation, to your point, I actually start with the first steps to prepare the next generation is to prepare yourself. Because if you're not aware of what you just said, some of those good instincts, like, hey, I want to provide, I want to take care of, I want to make it easy, I want them to have better experiences. I don't want them to experience what I experienced. If we're not aware of those natural inclinations as parents and we don't properly channel that, we actually could create the opposite outcome of what we want. So, well said.
So, a lot of these wealthy families have a significant family business that helped create the wealth in the first place. How do you balance the importance of business skills versus family history and trust in managing a family enterprise?
We work with a lot of family enterprises where there is a very large operating company and sometimes multiple. The short answer is when we're in a consulting engagement with a scenario like that, it's very important to know and have, for example, what does the business need to do? What does the enterprise need if the vision is to keep this moving through the generations? It's almost like take off your mom, dad, brother, sister hat and say, what does the business need? And then on the other side of it is what does the family need to continue to grow as a family? Because most cases in my experience, not everyone in the next generation or subsequent generations, especially when you move to the cousins level of generation, is everyone actively or equally operating in the family enterprise. So you need to know what the business needs, the enterprise needs, and you need to know what the family needs to maintain. I just got off a call yesterday with a woman who created a great business and she's very savvy. But partly why she's reaching out is she says, I know a lot of this, but I feel like a third party helping us walk through this so that the business continues forward, which is the vision. But I don't want it to unintentionally hurt my family because not everyone's in that business. And now we got to talk about who's going to own the business, who's going to get paid from the business. I think both are needed. And then when you come together, when we find that Venn diagram where the business and the family overlaps because family members are either an owner or an operator, then those business skills are very important. And it's business skills, but you also still need the trust. It's both and, especially for the parts of the family that are going to be responsible for stewarding and leading that family enterprise forward.
Earlier, you mentioned the notion of a family charter or constitution. Would you explain the process and importance of codifying a family charter and its core elements?
There is family charters, family constitutions. They're basically different names describing the same purpose, which is it's a process and ultimately a product, a document of some kind, digital, obviously, at least, where the family and what's typically in a charter and what's typically in a constitution ranges from what's the vision and values and mission of the family and or family enterprise, what's the governance structure, what are family policies, what's the family heritage, who are we, what do we represent, what's our intended legacy. We also include parts like we'll have the family take various assessment tools like the Clifton Strengths or the Myers-Briggs, you fill in the blank, and put that in there so you also understand the wiring, how people make decisions, what their natural strengths are, their philanthropy, if they're involved in philanthropy together, maybe their investment philosophy. The charter has all those components. And sometimes the families we engage will come with some of those pieces, and other times they'll have none of those pieces. And we're helping the family, as you would do, Alex, and your firm does, is help them build in and fill in those pieces. And the why behind that is because it helps anchor and navigate the generations forward. So it means that here's what we've all agreed to, we've all signed off on. And in some cases, some of the people on my team that I work with come from very successful family enterprises. When they hit a certain age, they get invited in to read the charter, and then they have to literally sign off on it. So it's a way to anchor and navigate the family through the generations about who they are, what's important to them, what are they trying to accomplish in their enterprise, and in who they are as a larger family. And it also will evolve. It's organic because subsequent generations, whether it's the market changing for the enterprise or maybe there's a liquidity event, now there's more married ins, there's more cousins, there's grandchildren, there's great grandchildren. It continues to evolve, but it's an anchoring to move the family forward. When we're engaged, we have three families right now where part of the engagement is we're literally helping them create their family charter. We call it the 100-year legacy blueprint. And the families really latch on to that more so. It has that kind of emotional connection. Here's what we're creating and here's what we're leaving behind.
And then there's something magic about putting things in writing. I've written a couple books, and I notice when I'm writing, I'm putting it on paper and it's permanent. I know you can change it, but there's a record. And when you're writing it, you say, do I really believe this? And it makes you really think through everything that you're writing. And then it forces you to structure it in your mind and have that conversation and the process that goes into putting it on paper. And now you created a structure, you've created accountability and something that people can read and challenge and change. And it just puts it at a different level than just talking about it and hoping for the best.
100%. And you hit on a number of important things. But yeah, the very process of bringing a set of family members, even if it's just a set of them or a few representatives that start the process and then ultimately bring in other people over time, you've just created a high functioning system that can create together and make decisions together. And you're right, once it's in writing, it's more real.
One of the big topics is financial literacy, particularly for later generations. What strategies do you recommend for fostering financial literacy and responsibility in younger family members?
In my legacy book, I talk about the importance of not only financial literacy or raising the financial IQ of family members, but also we call it life IQ or the intelligence of practical living and flourishing, like we've been talking about. So, the topic of money, not the family's wealth, but just the topic of money, should be in some way, in age appropriate ways, talked about from, let's call it kindergarten onward. And what I mean by that is practically I think the Bearstein Bears, they have a book for parents to read to their kids, which just starts playing with the concepts of money. To this digital money games for the gamers. They go online and actually play really cool 3D settings soccer, European football, but US soccer. And as they're playing the game, they have to stop at different points and ask and answer questions about financial matters. I'm just naming a few resources. There's a website called Napkin Finance which is free, lots of short videos on various money topics. For the young children, you want to obviously think age appropriate, but you also want to give them some experiences of money. So when they get a little older, depending on the philosophy of your family, you might give an allowance. So here, another idea in terms of educating the younger generation of a family is this idea of a piggy bank, which is something I did with my family when my children were younger. And these piggy banks are divided up into, you could see through them and they're labeled in these four categories of saving, investing, spending, and donating. So you have these four broad but very foundational pillars to the idea of money, what you could do with it. And so you use it in age appropriate ways. What we would do is if there was an allowance, or maybe some gifts from Christmas or Hanukkah or birthday, that we would help them think through why you're going to put it in spend versus donate versus invest, or maybe time to save it. So that's just another really practical way to teach and educate the values of money, but also the principles of money as part of the larger educating of the next generation, especially the younger generation.
Are there any approaches to philanthropy that can engage multiple generations of a family? I know that's typically a big priority for families.
It's one of those places that the family does begin to wrap around and very much related to the prior question. It might be the first glimpse into some money that the family has that might be in a private foundation, might be a donor advised fund, it might just be writing checks where you're absolutely right. The family wraps itself around and there are innovative ways that families are really thinking through their philanthropy. And I'm thinking, what about families? He's really passionate about. He doesn't want to just give money. He wants to give money to organizations that know how to then take that money and multiply it to have a greater impact. Or some families will create a junior board for younger family members, maybe young teenagers, to almost run parallel to the actual foundation board to learn. So they start practicing. So there are some really creative ways and innovative ways that are advancing philanthropy. But most of the families I find, unless they're pretty seasoned already and they're doing this for multiple generations, like the Rockefellers, most families who are, especially the newer wealth, one, two, three generations in, are still at the basics. Like, all right, how do we organize ourselves around giving? When do we include our children? Do they have a voice Do they have a vote? Do we match their giving? Do we put a certain amount of assets aside for the family to give as a whole? I'm working with a family right now that has two charitable funds, one for the parents, one for the next generation. There's another family we're working with that runs a very global company that we would all know. And what he decided to do is they created guardrails for their giving, who they're anchoring their giving to, and who they're not meant to be giving to in terms of causes and things like that. But in this case, the family I'm referring to's adult children were in 3 different states. So they agreed that there would be something that was horizontal in the giving for the, in this case, a private foundation. But then they did set money aside for each of the children, much smaller amount, but to give in their local communities. But before they actually signed off on that giving, the adults in the next generation would do some homework, come back and report in the family philanthropy meeting, here's what I learned, here's what I'm thinking of giving to, here's why. And then the family would discuss it and then they would sign off on it. And then the donation would be made, in this case, in the name of that child. So the child had a social connections to that community. So some of that foundational piece is bringing the family together. It's also a chance to learn. It's another version of education. There's traditional personal finance and investing, which is where a lot of people start. There's also all the language that goes with philanthropy and the tax implications and benefits of donating. And then there's also that other category, we'll just call it family law or estate planning, just the basic language of what's an heir, what's a grantor, what's a trust, what's a generation skipping trust, what's a revocable trust. This is stuff that you're experts in, you and your firm, but not everyone in families, even the wealth creators, understand it all. We've had some clients say, can you just help translate this for us? Well, that's not what we do. But they just like, help me make sense of this because I know that what they're trying to do is this, but what do they mean when they say this? So it's another opportunity, the philanthropy question you're asking, for a family to come together, anchor around a set of shared values, start creating some leadership and education and some discipline. And it's also a chance to feed their family cohesion and its legacy.
Richard, this has been fascinating. The soft side of wealth management often goes without as much focus as the money side and managing the money and all of that. So I appreciate you sharing that insight with our audience. I hope they learned from this experience and hopefully we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity, Alex. And like you said, I hope those who are going to listen to this will find some value for their own family situation. So thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please visit our website at insightfulinvestor.org to access past shows and learn more about our podcast. If you have questions, feel free to email us at info@insightfulinvestor.org. And if you enjoyed the discussion, please subscribe to this podcast to ensure you don't miss future episodes. And don't forget to forward today's conversation to others you think would enjoy listening. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as legal, business, investment, or tax advice. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinions and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Evoke advisors, their affiliates, or companies featured. Due to industry regulations, participants on this podcast are instructed not to make specific trade recommendations, nor reference past or potential profits. And listeners are reminded that securities trading, commodity trading, and alternative investments are complex and carry a risk of substantial losses. As such, they are not suitable for all investors. Listeners should be aware that guests featured on The Insightful Investor may have current or past associations with Evoke advisors or the host, including as an investment manager of a private fund opportunity by Evoke, or access through an affiliated Evoke fund, or as a client. Participation as a guest on the podcast should not be perceived as an endorsement or testimonial with respect to Evoke advisors, the podcast host, or their services. Similarly, the inclusion of a guest on the podcast does not imply that Evoke advisors or the host endorses the guest or any company with which they may be affiliated or employed. Evoke has neither paid nor received compensation from guests for their participation.